Well, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're talking about recovery and spirituality, and today we are honored to have a couple of special guests. They've certainly been special in my life, and I've got Dr. George Heymach and Dr. Kathleen Keenan on our podcast today. And I am so grateful for both of you being here. Thank you for doing this. And I wanted you to take just a few minutes and introduce yourself to the audience. Maybe give us a little bit about your story, where you're from, your background, education, career, kind of just give people, a quick version of your background. Why don't you start, Dr. Heymach, and then we'll go to Dr. Kathleen Keenan.
Okay, great. So I'm George Heymach. My life story, like many people's story, includes many different occupations. So I didn't start off becoming an addiction medicine physician. In fact, if I had been asked, I would have said, "You've got to be kidding." I was trained as a chemical engineer, was a professor of chemical engineering after finishing a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And wound up going into the service, and then having interest in the biologic effects in engineering, got into medicine, went to medical school in Philadelphia, and became an internist and did specialty training in pulmonary and critical care medicine at WashU in St. Louis, and practiced for over 20 years in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. In the late 90s, my wife made a decision for me, as many of my effects are, and suggested that maybe working 6 days a week, 16 hours a day was not compatible with having a wife and family. I got the message, and went back, got an MBA, and became a senior medical director in the hospital in Kansas City, and then chief medical officer, and moved on from there. Part of my job was working with people who had substance abuse. They were called impaired physicians. I didn't know what an impaired physician was. And I suddenly learned about alcohol and drug abuse and sexual abuse and so forth. And, I never thought that is anything that I should be involved with. And the long and short of it, after doing 5 years, was offered, sort of siphoned into a position as a medical director for the Physicians Health Program for the state of Missouri, an independent organization dealing with physicians who have substance abuse behavioral issues. I had done it for 5 years. I didn't think I was competent. And here I am, some almost 20 years later, and no longer with the Physicians Health Program, but now board certified in addiction medicine, and have been doing that for, as I say, about 20 years. And that's when I met Kathleen Keenan. So that's how I got into addiction medicine. It was sort of the back door twice around.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Keenan, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and career?
Okay. Well, I'm originally from California, and I started out as a teacher. And I had a midlife crisis around 40. And I'd been in therapy. And the whole time I was in therapy, I just thought it was the neatest thing. And I thought, wouldn't this be fun to do? And as I said, I went through a crisis and was wanting to change my life. And my spiritual life had a lot to do with it. After a period of prayer and meditating and contemplating, I just realized I'm going to be a psychologist. And I dashed down to the local university and enrolled, and eventually got my PhD, and it's just been wonderful. I did not start off in addiction medicine. My interest was in mind-body medicine, how the mind affects illness and how illness affects the emotions. And when I was working in a behavioral pain management program, I happened to be working with the gentleman who founded the Missouri Physicians Health Program. He was an anesthesiologist who noticed that so many of his colleagues had problems with addiction, and he wanted to do something to help them. So he worked with the Missouri Medical Association to start the Missouri Physicians Health Program. And he said to me, I want you to be one of our therapists. I want you to be working in this program. So I started doing that. And as George said, most of the physicians that were sent to me did have problems with addiction. Some of them were behavioral problems, but most of them had addiction. And that is something that I had to study up on real quick. And through that program, I met George, and George and I hit it off and have both been very passionate about helping people with addiction. And as you know, we now do a group and see people individually, and that's how it's taken its turn.
Yes, thank you. So you two met and started working together how many years ago?
12, 15. Yeah, about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so neither one of you really came to the addiction world from either family firsthand experience or any kind of addiction issues yourselves. Your career path kind of just ended up connecting you with that world. Am I understanding you right? Both of you kind of got there through your career path.
I come from a long line of addicts.
Okay.
I have lots of mostly alcoholics in my family. And frankly, all that experience made me originally think I want nothing to do with it.
Okay. I bet.
But God has a sense of humor.
Right.
So here I am.
Yeah. How about you, George?
Yeah, I've told Kathleen this. I knew nothing about, except Grandma always had a funny smell about her, and she was always happier than I thought she should be in certain times. It was only after she passed away that we discovered these small little bottles of what turned out to be vodka in various places in the kitchen. But I come from a German-Irish ancestry where, as one of my physicians in the program has said, I'm not, I don't have an alcohol abuse issue. I'm German-Irish, which is to say every time the family got together for any experience whatsoever, there was always alcohol in great abundance. And the fact that Uncle Harry died of cirrhosis and Grandma was a lush. So there's much like Kathleen, there's certainly enough in my family history as well.
And I think if I remember you saying it wasn't something you would have wanted. Like you, in your early, before you started working with addicts, you weren't thinking, oh, I'd really like to work with addicts.
No. In fact, my true confession, Kathleen's also heard this, is that, when I was in practice as a pulmonary critical care physician, the one group of patients I detested working with were alcoholics and drug addicts because they all lied. They didn't do what you asked them to do. They were all surreptitious about everything they did. And, as a pretty rigid engineering guy, that really freaked me out. And I just didn't want to deal with them at all. And I have looked back now in my latter years and recognized that the Holy Spirit said, George, you are so much better than those people. So you will have the opportunity in your latter life to spend all of your time with addicts and alcoholics and see what it's like. I mean, I truly believe that may be his sense of humor, because I had not only no interest in this, I really did not like dealing with these people. And what I've come to understand is what wonderful people they are. They're like me. They just have issues and problems. They have a disease. Hello, they have a disease. And Kathleen and I joke about this all the time because, you don't worry about you don't say, Fred, do you have a cholesterol problem? I mean, is your HDL really a little low? On the other hand, if people have an alcohol or a drug problem, they feel so much shame. So it is a disease. It's not, and that's just not spinning things. That's true.
Wow. Thank you. Well, so your early experience was almost with physicians exclusively, like your first
Yes.
several years into this, were with physicians. I do think there's still a bit of a stigma with addiction, with alcoholism, and I think that when people think of physicians, or like in my own case, people think of clergy, we think of people who are sometimes above that, superhuman, all that kind of stuff, and they would never have these kind of problems. But in your experience, your initial work were with a group of people that a lot of folks out there, I think, wouldn't imagine that there would be enough people that are physicians that have addiction that would create a life work around that.
I never had any idea. And, it's another thing that Dr. Keenan and I have talked about. The numbers, which are reproducible, suggest that 10 to 15% of physicians across the board during their lifetime of working will have an alcohol, drug, sex, gambling issue that will interfere with their quality of life. And I think that's the key thing. It's not just that they'll have a problem, but that it'll raise itself to the point where it interferes with their quality of life.
Well, one thing that working with physicians will help you realize, if you didn't already, is that being an addict has nothing to do with how smart you are.
Absolutely.
Because these people are very, very smart, and they still can't control this addiction.
Right. One of the phrases I heard when I first got into the recovery world was, your best thinking got you here. Mm-hmm. And I always thought I was a pretty good thinker, so.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Well, addiction does something that I like to refer to as, gives you something called hijack brain. And the fact of the matter is that it will completely hijack your higher order thinking. So instead of being rational and reasonable, your higher order thinking will, you use all your IQ points to rationalize what the addiction wants you to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
So the more intelligent you are, the better you are at lying, manipulating, making excuses, coming up with rationalizations. It's
yeah.
And the stories I could tell you about how physicians sneak around and learn to cheat. I mean, they're hilarious in the dark side. I mean, but of course, it is because physicians are pretty sneaky people when we don't want to be caught.
And so I think with that intelligence factor with physicians and other people like that in addiction, you don't want to admit that something beat you or defeated you, or that you can't think your way out of it. I mean, that's a part of our best thinking got us in a lot of good places with our careers, but then we can't think our way out of our addiction. It's kind of a crazy, ironic sort of thing that we have to admit.
That's right. I think that's why the first step is we admitted we were powerless, because the thinking just doesn't work. I think the more reliant a person is on their intelligence, the more it's a big part of who they are, like physicians, and the more they rely on it, the harder it is for them to realize that they can't think their way out of this addiction.
Right.
Harder for them to give up on that.
Well, at some point, you guys expanded your network of working with addicts to other people other than physicians. And I don't know at what point you expanded the people that you're working with, but I met both of you a little over a year ago. And so George and I had a common friend that introduced me to George, and we sat down and talked and got to know each other. And then he invited me into one of the group therapies that you do together. And that was over a year ago now. It was hard to believe that
It is hard to believe.
Time seems to have gone fast. But yeah, why don't you explain how you began to expand that circle of influence that the two of you are doing to outside the physician group? How did you end up starting the group therapy sessions? Give us a little insight into that.
You go for it, George.
What happens is when you're working with physicians, or for that matter, any professional, they say, I have a friend who, followed by, listen, this is a difficult topic, but my son has been using, or my neighbor next door, they have a problem with their daughter who, and the next thing you know is you're involved with lots of people from different walks of life. And, frankly, I can't say no. If somebody has a problem, I call up my psychologist, and, they all need to see Kathleen Keenan. I'm being a little facetious, but, when we have adolescents, I call a colleague of mine, Michelle Kylo, who's an expert in dealing with that. So, I don't do therapy. I know I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You got to know what your limits are. I really act as a mentor and guide for people. And I also monitor their addiction. But, most of the hard lifting is the lady that's on the screen with me, because she needs to deal with the causes of the addiction, and how this, thing got hold of people's lives.
Well, I think you're being very modest, but I think we make a good team. I deal with the psychological part of it, and he deals with the monitoring and the recovery piece, making sure that people go to meetings, that they're following their program, that they're, if necessary, they're being urine tested, and getting to the right doctors and getting the right medical help and all of that part of it. And those are all necessary pieces.
And Kathleen has had a huge practice of not just physicians, but of other professionals and other type people. So for her, it was just part and parcel. And, I think what you find is when you start working with people, and correct me, Kathleen, when you start working with people and you peel off the layers, you find out about, the fact that they've been having 3 or 4 drinks a night. I tell the story of a radiologist that I was seeing who was having behavioral issues that were just untenable in the hospital. And the hospital called us in to see him. And when I sat down with him, and we went through his issues, he casually mentioned that he and his wife had 4 to 5 bottles of wine a night. I mean, it was like he was saying, I fill my tank with a half a gallon of gas. I mean, 4 to 5 bottles of wine a night. And I didn't change the expression on my face. And I said, do you think it's a lot? And he said, well, I never drink while I'm on call. Well, that's
Right.
nice to know. But I mean, he didn't come in with an addiction problem. He came in with a behavioral. And I think this is what Kathleen sees a lot of.
Yeah. You can't run a psychology practice without ending up with a number of patients who have addiction issues of some sort. And, it's the problem is rampant. I mean, it's everywhere. Addiction
Right.
of some sort or another.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as a pastor, I used to talk a lot about addiction. I would use, biblical metaphors that are, I think, in the Old and New Testament for addiction and talk about addiction issues. Why don't you explain a little bit about the difference between, say, a substance addiction? Like when I think of a substance addiction, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of like alcohol, drugs, or food, something that you're ingesting into your body or shooting into your body or something like that. And then I think about behavioral addictions, which might be gambling or sex or social media addictions or binge watching TV things or all kinds of things that almost any behavior can become sort of obsessive compulsive and create problems for people. What do you see as the difference between substance addiction and behavior addiction? How do they go together? How are they different? How do they affect the brain? Is there a difference between how they affect the brain, the dopamine systems, and all that kind of stuff? I'm just curious.
I don't think there is a difference in the brain, but you're the addiction medicine guy. Is that right, George?
So a brief, very brief. Most of what we understand now, entirely different than 20 years ago, is based upon some very outstanding animal studies that have been reproduced in people to show that dopamine and serotonin are the two drivers of our addictive behavior. And the drive for dopamine, which affects a place in the middle of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and it's spelled just like it sounds, the nucleus accumbens, it then sends messages to the rest of the brain, most particularly to the front of the brain, that disinhibits, I told you it would be technical, but it disinhibits your thinking pattern so that you would never grab a woman by the butt, but you have a couple of drinks and the next thing you know is your hands are going where they don't belong. That sort of disinhibition it occurs with any kind of dopaminergic surge that impacts your neural centers in your brain. So it's easy to understand alcohol, but I think as Dr. Keenan points out, your addiction can be anything. It can be solving a very complicated mathematical equation. It can be going and running. It can be biking, Fred. You understand that?
Stay away.
Biking.
Yeah, getting too close to home there.
Right.
Talking about addictions, take a group of 5 or 10 kids that are between 15 and 18 and get them in a room and say, we're going to take away your iPhones or your smartphones for a couple of hours and watch these kids go through withdrawal.
Right.
I mean, exactly the same thing as you get. They get agitated, they get nervous, they get irritable, they get cranky. I mean, just as if they didn't have a cigarette, or they didn't have their Adderall, or they didn't have their fix. it's a withdrawal.
Yeah.
So behavioral and substances are different in cost, but I think, as Dr. Keenan points out, they're very, very similar.
Yeah, Dr. King, why don't you, like, what, when it comes to substance versus behavioral addictions, and you're working on a therapy treatment approach, how does that affect your approach? Is it different or is it the same?
Well, I think there's certain addictions that I refer to people who specialize in those. I don't treat people with sex addiction because there are people who specialize just in that and they're much better at it, and so I refer. But in general, the way I look at it is that addictions generally get started because they offer either soothing or escape from emotions that we don't want to deal with, emotions that are unpleasant. And so we have to look at what are the emotions that the person is trying to escape from. And then another piece of that is it's often a vicious cycle. They have emotions that are painful, that they don't want to deal with. It's just too hard to feel. So they escape or they seek some sort of comfort or soothing through a substance, through a behavior, but it's some way to soothe themselves. And then they feel guilty about that. And then they start beating up on themselves. And that inner critic takes a hold and starts, telling you what a terrible person you are. And that's wrong, bad. And then that just becomes one more thing that you need to escape from and need to be soothed from. And so you need to you go back to your addiction, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So that's what I work on, is getting beneath the, when a person first comes in with an addiction, oftentimes their approach is, I have this bad habit and it has to be fixed. I'm bad. Help me get rid of it. And that's not the goal. The goal is not to get rid of it. The goal is to figure out where that behavior fits in the overall schema of their personality and the way they relate to themselves. What's the pain they're trying to avoid? How are they loving or hating themselves because of this? And try to help them bring compassion and curiosity and understanding to the whole process.
Do you find that a lot of times there's some type of trauma, either little t trauma or big traumas, that are rooted in some of these, or is it just behaviors that we pick up along the way and we just start soothing and it just gets out of control because we've got the genes for addiction?
Well, I think in my experience, almost all the time, there's trauma of some sort, and that's probably how those genes get tripped. I'm not sure, but but trauma is often at the root of this.
Right. And what kind? Yeah, describe traumas for people, because I've heard people use even because a lot of times we just think of big trauma, like a sexual abuse as a kid or something like that. But there's a lot of traumas that still trigger these things that are a lot like what I've heard somebody use the phrase small t traumas, that like we wouldn't even think of them as a trauma, but they are. I mean, they affect us in that way, I think. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, a trauma is something that overwhelms us emotionally to the point that we can't digest it in the normal way that we deal with feelings. And you have to remember that what is overwhelming depends a lot on our age, our level of maturity, the defenses, the support we have, all of those kinds of things. You can take a child and that has a trauma, but if they have a lot of loving adult support and that these people help them understand what's going on, help them articulate it, and process it, doesn't end up being damaging. But it can be something rather small that happens to someone who doesn't have that kind of support, doesn't have anybody to talk to about it, feels a lot of shame about it.
Can you give an example along those lines? That's that's a smaller variety that we wouldn't normally think is as traumatic.
Okay, but this is I've had a number of clients who had experiences of, say, transferring schools when they were in junior high school, and they get to the new school and they don't have any friends and they're bullied and they don't fit in. You don't think of that as being, as bad as being raped or something like that. But these are traumas. These are traumatic experiences for these kids. They are life-changing experiences that change their view of themselves and their view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a good one. I just put out a 4th blog that I wrote, and I describe, I changed schools from kindergarten to 1st grade.
Mm-hmm.
And on my walk home every day in this new school, I got bullied by a 3rd grader. And
there you go.
And then I describe how my dad taught me to fight to deal with this bully.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but how that kind of played itself into, and I honestly, I would have never thought about that as a trauma.
Right.
I would have just thought of it, it's just a part of growing up. I mean, and I wouldn't have thought about it in a way that it set into my brain patterns certain patterns that I literally carried with me until now, right? Like, but I didn't ever think of it that way till the last couple of years, honestly, dealing with all this stuff I've been dealing with. Yeah.
This is one of the issues I have with clients all the time is getting them to see that these things are traumatic, because they go, well, everybody goes through that. That's
right.
No big deal. It happens all the time. They're looking at it from an adult point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And when it happened to you, you had the mentality and the defenses of a child, and that's entirely different.
One of the things, Kathleen, that you may want to address that we see a lot of today are, because it's so common, are split families.
Oh.
and the divorces, the death of a parent, the abandonment, perceived abandonment by the loss of the first father and the new stepfather. These kinds of, particularly as children, it's been my experience, have been huge triggers. And I think that's a great mention that you call it a trigger, because we know, for example, that if your dad or your first degree relative, mom, dad, brother, sister, has an alcohol problem, alcohol use disorder, which is what we call it today, then you will have a 50% chance of having an alcohol use disorder. Now, does that mean you're destined, much like a BRCA1 or BRCA2 to get breast cancer? No, it doesn't mean that. But if you have a trigger that hits you and you don't have the coping mechanism, that's when it comes. That's when it comes. And we see this all the time. When I sit down and talk with these guys and gals, you find out that they, what they seemingly think was just like, but everybody had the bullying when they were in school, but not everybody had the same coping skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those traumas that you mentioned are easily passed off as not traumatic, right? And people don't give much thought to how they might have hardwired their brain and the triggers that are around that hardwiring,
That's right. We develop ways of managing those things that become fixed parts of our personality. and often they get us into trouble later.
Yeah. It did me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Let's talk a minute about spirituality. I mean, because I read in the big book that about 50% of the people who land in a 12-step program are atheist or agnostic. And so because of this, there's a whole chapter written to the agnostic in the big book. And yet it seems like spirituality plays a very important role in recovery. And so I'd love to hear the two of you speak to that issue. How does spirituality play a role in recovery, and even particularly for those that might not think of themselves as tied to a particular religious tradition?
Kathleen, why don't you?
Okay. Well, I think I think spirituality is an innate part of us. Religion is something else. Religion is something you choose to adopt, or whatever. But I think we all have a spiritual nature, and it can get expressed in different ways. And so what I try to do is help people find a way of expressing and experiencing their own spirituality that's compatible to their thinking, that's comfortable for them. But it's a way of connecting with something bigger than yourself. And I think that that's really important, to be able to connect with something bigger than yourself when you're dealing with an addiction. Well, in life, period, but especially when you're dealing with an addiction. So I try to help people find this something bigger than myself that feels comfortable and compatible to them.
Okay.
You know, Fred, you've been in our group and you've heard some of the people speak of their sort of newfound spirituality, and people who will say, God was frankly never in my life. I mean, mom and dad used to go to church, but God really didn't play a role. And then as they get sober and they see how the Spirit has come upon them, but how they have turned over the control of their lives to a higher power. Because when I say to them, when they say, well, I'm not into this turning things over to somebody else, I want to be in control. To which I say, how's it been working out for you?
Right, exactly.
And it's sort of a smart ass answer, but they recognize that, there are times in life when you need to let somebody else walk with you and guide you and take your hand. That's the key to recovery. You can't do it yourself. What do you think, Kathleen?
I agree.
Yeah.
And that reminds me that when George and I were just chatting earlier today, and one of the things that we were talking about is you can't do it by yourself. It takes a village. It not only takes spirituality, but it takes people. It takes a community. It takes other people supporting you, and that's important.
It's so much fun to watch guys who are very macho suddenly try to figure out how they're going to call another guy for a date. It has nothing to do with sex, but it has to do with calling him up so we can get together and be together, because that's what we all crave. We all crave the warmth, the spirituality of the fellowship of others. And one of the fun things in sobriety is you find other people who are just as longing for love and as longing for sobriety as you are.
Yeah, that's great. So let's take somebody who maybe the God thing is a turnoff to them. They don't want to have anything to do with God or Jesus or the Bible or whatever that might, what form, what religion that might take. But how do you help them realize that there's still a spiritual path for them that can help them in recovery? How have you? I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with that. Bumping into
I
folks
have
who
them
kind of
find
have
out
a.
what,
Go ahead.
no, I was going to say they can find out what their higher power is. Doesn't have to be Jesus or Allah or, um, you know, one of the other gods. It can be something else. It can be the fellowship of the group. The higher power is the fellowship. I mean, there are AA groups that are specifically formed for atheists and for agnostics, much as there are AA groups for LGBTQ. I mean, there are all sorts of AA groups, and obviously some of the more radical or different kinds are out in the West Coast. But there are people who are accepting of anything. You don't have to say the Lord's Prayer. You don't have to believe in Christ. What you need to do is open your heart and just let yourself feel. That's very tough, particularly when you're so vulnerable. But atheists and agnostics, AA is not an issue. You need to find a place where you can be comfortable. You don't have to say the Lord's Prayer. You don't have to, be a Christian for sure. There are a lot of Jewish people in AA, and for that matter, Muslim people in AA.
And Buddhism and
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think the group is a first step for a lot of people in spirituality, that they can find that the group is bigger than them. It's loving, it's caring. That can become a very important, I think, spiritual step for people that really begins to open them up to this idea that they need help outside themselves, and that can be a great first step. We're wired for community. I really agree with that, George, and that has to be a part. Sharing your emotions and your feelings with a group of people that love you and care for you and that aren't going to judge you. That's such a huge part of our spirituality. That community, and having a safe place to do that.
It's a turn on for me to watch these guys who are really solid, masculine, macho guys turn to another guy and say, "I love you." I mean, it's like, wow. I mean, it has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with, the Greeks did a much better job of talking about the various types of love. But I mean, this is not, something that is ugly. It's something that's very beautiful.
That's good. I'm curious, what you've been working now with addicts for over a decade, almost 2 decades. What are some of your big takeaways that you think would be important for the whole rest of the world to know about, that say wouldn't ever consider themselves as a substance addict or big addict or whatever? What are some takeaways for the general population that wouldn't view themselves as addicts that you think would be important for them to know and understand? I'm just curious.
Kathleen and I talked about just that topic before we came in. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, that's where I was going to say it takes a village, but I think you're asking a little bit different question. Are you saying but they might have some addiction issues themselves? Is that?
So my personal opinion is that most everybody struggles with some kind of addiction issue at different points in their life, right?
Right.
But No, I'm kind of more or less thinking of some of the bigger takeaway. Like I think there's a lot of people that would think about addicts like you guys did. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with those people. And
Right.
now you've been working with them for almost 2 decades. What are some big takeaways that you think the whole world could learn from the work that you've been doing? Even the people that would not even want to have anything to do with addicts. Those. I guess
They
that's
are us.
Yeah.
yeah.
They are us.
So
I mean,
explain that, because
if
people
you
don't
don't,
think that.
I mean, if you don't think that there's a lot of addiction around, you've been doing the ostrich maneuver and burying your head. It's all around, and there are lots and lots of people who are closet drinkers. I mean, people don't go around getting sloshed, but they have no difficulty having 5 or 6 drinks in a night just to relax. And incidentally, I took some pills from a friend of mine. It makes her sleep much better, and she's not anxious at all now. And she gave me a bunch of her pills, so I've been taking them. And it's not just older people. I work with medical students, as Kathleen does. You would be flabbergasted at the number of kids in graduate school and in medical school who are sharing pills. That doesn't really happen. It does happen. It does happen, and it's not because they want to be addicts. It's because there's nothing like having a little Adderall before you take your exam. So you borrow it from the guy next, and the first time the second, and after that you get your own prescription by recognizing you have ADHD too, or you have anxiety, and you'll find a doctor who'll write a prescription. So to answer your question, Fred, um, the take home message is, if you think you have a problem, or if you think somebody has a problem, talk to somebody early. You don't have to make a commitment. It's not like dialing a phone number and giving your name, rank, and serial number, but don't let it go. Don't let it go, because problems unaddressed only get worse, or as we say in New York City, worster. Um, I mean, they go from bad to worse to worster. Kathleen, you know what I'd like you to show? Fred, could you let me put a chart up? Can you give me a share? Can I do that?
While he's doing that, Kathleen, I've because I'm putting my story out right now through blogs and videos. I've had a number of people reach out to me. Just had a few meetings recently with people who themselves were wondering if they needed help. Like, am I an addict? I'm not sure if I am. Am I on the border? Am I getting into trouble? What are some danger signs that would help somebody do a little bit of self-evaluation in terms of,
Well, in general, yeah, that's a good question. In general, we look at, is it affecting your relationships? Is it affecting your work? Is it affecting your ability to think and solve problems? Is it affecting your ability to function in any of the major? Is it changing you in any way? And if it is, then it's something to look at. And I think that if you can avoid being ashamed and pathologizing yourself, but just, I want to check into this, I want to learn more about it, is a good way to approach it. And to realize how common it is, as George said. And another thing I was going to say when you asked the question originally was that people need to understand that there's a difference between the person and the disease. Very, very good people can do some things that are not so good when they have addiction.
All right. Yeah, I think that's true. So, yeah, I'm seeing this I'm seeing this now, George. So you see,
Kathleen, I'll let you talk
yeah,
through this.
talk through. What's it called again?
The stages of change.
Okay.
And when people come to us with an addiction problem or a suspected addiction problem, what we try to do is move them from wherever they are now to the next stage on the diagram. So if they have no clue at all, they think there's no way that there's anything wrong, you try to get them to be a little bit more aware, be curious about how this behavior is affecting their lives, and to just to be more insightful about it, get some distance from it, be curious, and then eventually maybe to start thinking about what maybe could I do about it, investigating what are the options, and then from there you pick an option and you make a commitment to choosing some way that you're going to try to modify the behavior. And then we go around to, and then assuming it's successful, you go to maintenance, and then sometimes there's relapse. But the idea is to move people step by step through this, through these phases until they get to recovery, till they get to being able to the point where they're able to commit to a program of recovery. Because the person that walks in your office and says, my wife says that I drink too much. I'm not so sure. Maybe I do, but I don't think so. That person is not ready to hear you need to go to treatment.
Right. Yeah, they're still rational. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but they might be ready to hear, well, what do you think? Why don't you start writing down how many drinks you have? Why don't you start paying attention to how does it affect your sleep? Pay attention to what's your mood like the next day after you've had these 5 drinks. Pay attention, start noticing how it affects your interaction with your wife and your kids. Just notice. We're not asking them to make any changes at all, just to notice. And that can be very powerful.
Yeah, so I was thinking, so a part of this is like self-reflection for somebody
Yes.
who's actually wondering, do I have a problem? Because a lot of people, are actually having a real problem, and they're reflecting on, do I really have a real problem?
Right.
And that's really good for them. I also have, the parents of children, of adult children sometimes, or friends, or a family member who pretty much knows that the other person has an addiction problem, but they really don't know how they can help in the process of, they don't know how to help that person a lot of times. They don't know whether to harp on them or whether to, confront them, or what's the best thing other people can do if they have a friend or a family member that's in trouble and they can see it, but they don't know how to reach out and help that person.
We share the 16-year-old child of a physician that we were able to address this question. And this was a very bright young man, but had been in a family with other, older brothers, and totally defiant, using drugs, sneaking out windows, doing what all 16-year-old boys do that are unbridled. And the family did not know what to do. And Kathleen and I conspired and were able to get this young man into a treatment facility, and which incidentally involved the parents so that they understood how to deal with this. So adolescents are a little bit different than older people.
Right.
Physicians are very easy because they all want a license, and
Right.
you make it very clear to them you don't have to follow what we're saying. You can do it your own way, but oh, incidentally, you're not going to be practicing medicine.
Right.
That that sort of for people like attorneys, bankers, real estate chiefs. I have a corporate CEO I work with. The constraints are not the same. And it really depends upon what sort of strength they have in their families and whether you can get them to sit down and talk to Kathleen Keenan or a Kathleen Keenan equivalent. She really doesn't take care of all of Kansas City, but um, but not everybody, not all therapists are equally talented. That's not a pejorative; it's just a fact of dealing with because these are very difficult clients.
Yes.
If you have a an adult child or an adult friend or just a friend that you are worried about, I think one of the, you ask, what do you do? I think, well, one thing you don't do is shame them, nag them, tell them how bad this is going to be. You're turning out to be just like your Uncle George, and you know what happened to him, that kind of thing. I think it's to express loving concern, to talk about your own feelings. I'm worried. I feel scared when I see this happen. Name the behavior, and I would love for you to, maybe I'm wrong, but I'd love for you to talk to somebody and check this out. Because I care about you, because I love you.
And that's Kathleen's giving away one of her secrets. And the secret is to use the word I, not you, but I. I obviously am worried about you. I'm concerned. I love you very much. I want
Mm-hmm.
not you need to you, because when it's you, the person has to defend themselves.
Right.
When it's I, they feel much more compassionate about understanding that it's not about them, it's about you.
That's good. I think that's such a challenging point for so many people. And because
It's
you do
huge.
want to
It's
help, you
huge.
care, you love these people deeply, and yet you feel so stuck. Like there's just
Hopeless.
nothing
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah,
And I think
they,
that's about as I think other than prayer and care, but reaching out with I statements. This is how I feel. This is how I'm responding, and I care about you. And would you consider getting curious and talking? That's
Right.
a fairly easy step compared to the shame approach.
exactly.
Definitely, everybody's already dealing with that, right? We're already buried in
Right.
shame. I think that's really helpful.
Yep.
That's helpful. Well, we uh, I think are at a good place to sort of wrap this up. Or do you have any final comments that you'd like to make? There'll be people listening into this from anywhere from people who are struggling with issues themselves all the way to people who are friends and family members of people who are struggling. We're in COVID right now. I've been looking at some of the CDC reports, and a lot of these, issues of substance abuse and anxiety and depression and suicide ideation are up 26 to 40%
Right.
in the last 10 months of COVID. Do you have any like final comments that you'd like to make to our audience?
Well, I'll say something and then I'll let Kathleen close out. But isolation, which is what we're doing all the time these days, isolation is one of the biggest triggers for people getting themselves into rabbit holes. Um, and when you try to restrain yourself from having relationships, and you don't know how or don't are not able to share with someone else, it makes your stressors much, much greater, as you point out, Fred. Um, and so, the COVID-19 is a fantastic challenge. And you're exactly right. The UK has some of the best data, and it shows that people who are in abstinence have a larger recidivism rate, and the people who are alcoholics are drinking more. That's kind of the best data we have so far in the UK. Um, but insomnia and anxiety are the two big things that are now causing problems. And if you can't sleep, it brings on all sorts of ugliness, crankiness, mood changes, and makes your anxiety worse. So early, early help is so helpful. Um, don't be afraid to ask somebody anonymously, what should I do? Where should I go? Um, and there are people out there to help you.
What do you think,
Well,
Dr. Keenan?
I think the thing I want to say, I'm really doesn't have anything to do with COVID or only tangentially, is people, generally speaking, when they have addiction, are very afraid. They're afraid to get help. They're afraid to give up their drug of choice, or they're. It feels like death. It feels like life as I know it will be over if I do this. And what I want to say is that there is so much joy on the other side of this. The very best people I know are addicts in recovery, because they have done the work. They've dug inside themselves. They've looked at their issues. They've found the spirit within them. They've struggled with their demons. And the joy and the freedom that you get when you do that is just phenomenal. And it's so worth it. So that's what I want to say. It's just so worth it.
And I think I know somebody that can testify to that.
Yeah.
Who has a big microphone in front of him.
Right.
Because he is such an awesome, he was an awesome pastor before, but an even more awesome pastor now.
Well, I think that gives hope to people who are struggling, who are facing addictions, that it's not the end of your life, even though it might feel like death if you give something up like that, but that the good work that goes through it and the good support systems that are out there. I'm so thankful for you guys that, and just the love and care that you've given me, but those support systems are there if people reach out. And if you're listening right now and you're in trouble, I'd encourage you, reach out. And there are networks available that can connect you, that can get you the right help. And there's hope on the other side. And I love that comment that you make about how I've heard you say it about physicians, that physicians who work through these issues can be better physicians because they have higher sensitivity to the needs of people.
Pastors that go through this are better pastors. People that go through this are better people because you have found out. I mean, we have a dentist in our group who was divorced when his drug habit became uncontrollable, and he's now back with his wife, and he said, it's better than any life I had with my wife beforehand. I am so glad I was a drug addict. I mean, that's the bizarreness of the whole thing.
Right.
I would never want to be a drug addict, but I'm so glad I was a drug.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you so much for being on this podcast, and thanks to all of you who are listening and tuning in. Dr. George Heymach and Dr. Kathleen Keenan. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you for taking your time and sharing with this audience. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
For inviting us.
Thank you, Fred.
Harbin Media Production.